Okay, good morning. So here I'm going to talk to you today about the role of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who is here on the top right-hand side of your screen. For today's lesson, you will need a pen and a piece of paper. If you've got your exercise book, brilliant. If you don't have either of those, then please just use Microsoft Word or something similar. Your title is Who is Senator Joe McCarthy? Can you please make sure that's underlined and written in your book? Or, of course, on the computer screen. So today we're going to talk about Senator McCarthy. We're going to work out why he was so famous and why he caused such controversy. He is here on the top left-hand side of the screen, the man pointing towards the middle of the screen. He was an American politician. He was a senator of Wisconsin, which is in the northeast of the country, and he was a politician during the Cold War. Now, something I want to point out to make really clear before we go any further is the difference between these two men who have very similar names and were famous at the same time in American history. Now, McCarthy is the subject of today's lesson. He is a senator, a politician. And MacArthur, who is in the bottom right-hand side of your screen, is a general. He is the man who leads the US and UN invasion in Korea during the Korean War. He is a military general. He is also has a very similar opinion towards communism as McCarthy, but they have very, very different roles. Remember, MacArthur was the one who was really, really keen to drop an atomic bomb on China during the Korean War, but the president at the time, who was President Truman, decided that was too far and had him sacked. So we are not talking about MacArthur today. We're talking about McCarthy and why he was so controversial. So what I'd like you to do, based on what you know about McCarthy and what you know about the history of the Cold War, I want you to write down the answer to your starter question. What do you know already about the Cold War? Pause this video for 2 minutes. Once you click play again, we're going to move on to the next slide. So pause this now, write down your answer to your starter question. So the starter question you should have written down could have contained some of this information. So we know the Cold War was a period of intense, serious rivalry between the two most powerful countries in the world. They were known as superpowers because they were the most powerful of all. Now, the two superpowers were Russia, and you can see Russia here in the red on the right-hand side of the screen, the easternmost country, with the capital Moscow. Now, Russia is red. The reason why we give it that color is because it was communist, and red is a color we most often associate with communism. Now, if you can see around Russia, I'll just point it with my cursor so you can see clearly, there are some countries that are pink. Okay, these make up the Eastern Bloc, or what we know as the allies of Russia. So some countries down through Eastern Europe, Mongolia, and some countries you can just about see. We've got Vietnam looping around here, and Korea off the side down here, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, these guys were all allies. They were all tied very, very closely together. They were part of a pact called the Warsaw Pact, which meant that they would all step in and look after each other if a crisis appeared. So these guys were linked very, very closely, and their enemies were the other side of the Atlantic, well, on the most part. This is America here, with Washington as its capital. And as always, as with Russia, the other countries that are in the lighter blue are what we call the Western Bloc, so the countries that are allies with Washington. Now you can see that Canada is obviously an ally of Washington. You can see that most of Western Europe are allies of America as well. Okay, and this means that actually here there's going to be a big battleground. Now this country that I'm just running the cursor down here is Berlin. Berlin was one of the places where there was serious, intense conflict in the Cold War. We've learned a little bit about the pulling down of the Berlin Wall towards the end of the 20th century. Another conflict that we've learned about is the Korean War. Obviously, that's a really intense point when we see two sides fighting a proxy war, where they're not actually fighting each other, but they're fighting through another country to try and prove that they are the best. The Cuban Missile Crisis is another seriously intense period. What the Russians do is they send some ships around down here to Cuba, which is underneath the T of this Cold War sign, and they on Cuba, what they do is they station some nuclear weapons. Those nuclear weapons can easily get to America, and basically they could destroy every single American city within a few minutes of the leader of of Russia clicking the red button. Now this sends fear into the Americans' hearts, and what they do is they make sure that those ships never make it to Cuba, and they never actually set up the missile sites there. Unbeknownst to the world, over in Turkey, here we are. The Americans have missiles set up there, so the Russians might not be safe, but the Americans are. And the final conflict that makes up the intense points of the Cold War is the Vietnam War. Now you can see Vietnam here is coloured in pink, so we know that it's a communist country. Okay, and the Americans are pretty determined for it not to be communist. So what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about why the communists and the capitalists were such enemies, why they couldn't just work together. You will have seen this analogy, I'm sure, before. I've used it a lot to explain it over the years of teaching. If we imagine that we've got a pizza, like here, Russia being communist, every single person gets an equal slice of this pizza. Okay, everyone gets an equal slice of the country's wealth. This meant that anyone, no matter their background, no matter their skills, would be treated equally and would get paid the same amount. So no one was more wealthy than anybody else. Now, this is all wonderful in theory, but what often happens is somebody tends to abuse the situation and monopolizes it and takes more money than everybody else. So it's not always fair. Now, what many wealthy Americans were really worried about here is if they had a communist country, then all their wealth would be taken away from them and then spread out between everybody else in their country. So that meant they weren't going to be able to enjoy the kind of lifestyle that they got used to. So they were really, really, really worried that communism would come to their shores, people would think it's a great idea, and they would lose their money. So America was a capitalist. And they spent a lot of time condemning communism as the worst way of being. Now, like a slice of pizza, we're going to take a pizza route here and use this analogy in a slightly different way. As we can see here, most of the people who make up this pizza slice, imagine they're people rather than bits of pasta and bits of cheese, and tomatoes and things. Most of the people make up the bottom of society. So most of the people have very, very little money. Only a few, this narrow section at the top, are very rich. So this is what a capitalist society looks like. Most people at the bottom and very few at the top, compared to communist society where everyone gets an equal portion of the wealth. Now what's different here is that there are much fewer controls on the people, and they can, if they want to, make the jump between being down here at the bottom of society and being right at the top. Okay, so people have the freedom and the opportunity to become rich, whereas in the Russian society and the communist society, nobody has the freedom because they are told what they need to do for the good of the state. So what I'd like you to do, take communist as a subtitle and then jot underneath what a communist society looks like and how everyone is equal, and then put capitalist as a subtitle and write down underneath what a capitalist society looks like and how that system works. Make sure in your explanation you've got an idea of the differences between the two, so you get an idea of how the two sides could be rivals. So take a couple of minutes, pause this video, and make sure you get your notes underneath those two subtitles. When you come back to me, we're going to talk about this man here in a bit more detail because we need to know where Joseph McCarthy fits in. So he was a bully, really, and he terrified the American citizens about communism. So he represented those people who were scared. Now, the fear of communism spreading was called the Red Scare. I've put it in red and in bold just to make it stand out for you. People were scared of communism after World War I. Those of you who've looked at the Sacco Vanzetti case will know that that was an example of two men who were falsely accused of a crime, of a murder, because people thought they were communist. So this was evidence for how we know that Americans were already, after World War I, scared of communism. But the Red Scare returned after World War II. This is because of the Cold War that we've just been talking about, and it became worse after 1949. Now, if we flick back to this image here, this country, which is China, okay, became communist in 1949. Now, if this country becomes communist, goes red as well, then look at all these potential countries, all these yellow countries, which could become communist too. That scared the living daylights out of America because they thought that communism would spread so far that it might eventually reach America and America would become communist too. So, what I'd like you to do to summarize what I've just been talking about here is to answer these three questions. I want you to write down in full sentences what the Red Scare was, what happened in 1949, and then why this event would make the Red Scare worse. So, pause this video now and answer those three questions in full sentences, please. And when we come back, we are going to talk about what McCarthy did. So you've got a lot of text on the screen and just two questions. I want you to find out what McCarthy did and what made him stop. So essentially what he was doing was he was putting up these witch hunts where he was trying to find people who he suspected of being communist. So many hundreds were completely innocent people and they were condemned, they were shouted at, they were seen as being, betraying America. Now remember, we're after the war here, so lots of people are trying to find the American dream, the ideal of a beautiful house, a beautiful car, and all the opportunities that America can give you, including freedom and patriotism and democracy. They absolutely are suspicious of anybody else who does not follow that idea. So a communist is somebody who's the opposite of that idea of freedom and opportunity and the American dream. That fear soon became known as McCarthyism after McCarthy, because he was the one who was pushing for it the hardest. So in your questions at the bottom, what did McCarthy do? Here is one of your things. He condemned innocent people for being communists, and he encouraged people to be fearful of their neighbours for being communist. This meant that innocent people were put on trial. So what McCarthy did within government is he started a campaign against anyone who was suspected. So hundreds were put on trial with no evidence. But McCarthy still managed to scare newspapers and the press, and therefore the American people, that there could be communists anywhere. The big phrase was "Reds are under the beds." That there could be a communist underneath your bed. They could be hiding anywhere, and those people could threaten the way of life of America. So your next question is what made him stop eventually, and this is your third paragraph. McCarthy went too far, people thought, when he started accusing officers in the US Army. He was uncovered as being a bully, and people thought that actually he had spent too much of the government's money trying to uncover innocent people for doing a crime they hadn't done, when actually there were so many other real complaints that Americans were facing that he should have been spending the money on instead. So pause this video here, and I want you to answer these next two questions in full sentences. And when we come back, we'll talk about the next slide. So here there are two videos. One I want you to watch. The second one is an extension. The first one, this is about McCarthy, and it's a description from a historian called Uhuru Williams. And what he talks about is essentially what we've just learned. So it's a summary really in a slightly different way of what we've just learned. I want you to watch this video, the one at the top, and I want you to write down how McCarthy treated people he thought would be communist. And then I want you to write down what Uhuru Williams says is the turning point is in changing the way people thought of McCarthy, in his status changing. So what was the turning point in changing the way people thought of McCarthy? Your second video is slightly longer. I want you to watch that as an extension. It's not compulsory, unlike the first one. I want you to find out what McCarthyism was and how it was able to happen. So that one provides you a little bit more of the context of the Cold War in America in the 1950s. So pause this video now, open up at least the first YouTube video in another tab, and write down the answers to these questions in full sentences. If you find you have more time, or you're interested, please look at the second video, but this, as I said, is an extension. Now, as a summary, I've just got one question for you this time. I want you to describe two ways in which the Red Scare impacted American people in the 1950s. Remember, the Red Scare is synonymous, it's the same thing really as McCarthyism, it's the fear of communism. So you just need to have 2 points here. You don't need to explain them, you just need to state them. Make sure you've got evidence to back up your points. I've got some tips there for things you could include. You could say one way in which the Red Scare impacted American people in the 1950s was to encourage fear of communism due to the Cold War. Then you need to tell me a little bit about the Cold War, that it was a rivalry between the East and West, between Russia and Americans were really scared that communism could spread to their shores. Then you'd say another way that the Red Scare impacted American people was that McCarthy encouraged people to suspect each other, which led to many hundreds of people being falsely accused due to McCarthyism. You can then tell me a little bit about that the Red Scare was this fear of communism that spread more and more during the years of the Cold War. So submit this work just as you would normally, straight to show my homework, or if that doesn't work, straight to your subject teacher. Good luck with it. Please post a comment if you've got any questions about anything, or if something doesn't work. And yeah, enjoy.